Welcome to Mysterious Goings On. We're going to get right to the show after these messages. This episode is brought to you by Spotify and Anchor, your source for the best in music, podcasts, and more. You can also be someone who helps bring more to your life with Mysterious Goings On by being a listener supporter. Please click on the link in our show notes and you will be offered 3 tiers for support. We have a 99-cent per month tier, $4.99 per month, and $9.99 per month. You can buy it with Google Pay or use with a credit card instead. This helps keep the show going. I could use your support if you really enjoy Mysterious Goings On, and lots of you have since 2016. We'd love to keep going, and some listener support like you would be very, very helpful to me in keeping the show moving right along there. So, as I always say, at the end of every show, keep reading, but also keep listening, and please consider supporting Mysterious Goings On. You know, a good friend of mine's a real estate agent, and she is not at all original when she says it's all about location, location, location. And you know what? I think the same can be said about writers and the places they established where their characters live. I don't mean just world building. I don't just mean they're on planet Earth. I mean, you know, every writer, I think, who's got some really good chops seems to find a way to make a city the character's own, if that makes sense to you. For example, most of my stories are set either in a small town in Nebraska or in Key West, Florida, and that seems to work for those characters. Well, hold on, we're going to learn a lot more about how that works for someone who's got incredible number of books under her belt, and is going to talk to us all about that. And it's Matty Dalrymple. She's the author of the Kinnear suspense novels and suspense shorts and the Lizzy Ballard Thrillers. She lives in Chester County, Pennsylvania, where I've never been, and enjoys vacationing on Mount Desert Island, Maine. Oh, I've never been there either. I want to go. And Sedona, Arizona. I think I've been there. And these locations provide the settings for her work. She's a member of Sisters in Crime and the Brandywine Valley Writers Group. She also podcasts, writes and speaks on the writing craft and the publishing voyage as the Indy Author. And she's also a member, as am I, of the Alliance of Independent Authors. Matty Dalrymple, welcome to Mysterious Goings On.
Thank you. I am very excited to be here.
Location. You know, I want to talk about that with you, but first I'd really like to just dive in with the kind of the softball question, if that's okay with you. Love to know, when did you start this whole writing game? When did this happen with you?
Well, I had done some writing when I was in college. I wrote some mainly short stories, and I was inspired to write by my father, who was primarily a short story writer. He actually got some stories published in Collier's and Cosmopolitan back in the 50s.
Wow.
Under the name William Kingsfield, which is where I took the imprint name for my indie imprint from, William Kingsfield Publishers. But of course, he had set the stage for me becoming a writer. And it was great because I would write the short stories, I would give them to my dad, and then my dad would go through all the pain of sending them out to publications, and he would only let me know when something got accepted. You know, I never had to deal with it when it didn't get accepted. So that was kind of a nice scenario. But then I left college. I kind of left short story writing of any kind behind. And then many years later, in 2011, I was vacationing with my husband in Yellowstone. We were at the Yellowstone Inn, and if ever a place was going to be haunted, the Yellowstone Inn would be one of them. And I was describing to him the scenario I had in my head. It was just one scene playing out in my mind like a movie. Speaking of location. And it was about a woman who goes to a home. She's a woman who is able to sense dead people, and she's gone to the home on a consulting engagement to see if there's anything off about the home. And the reader knows, but she does not know that a murder has taken place there. And so my husband encouraged me to pursue that. I started writing that night at the Yellowstone Inn, and that became my first book, which was The Sense of Death.
Oh man, isn't that the best? I love that story. I won't bore the listeners here who or regular listeners here, but my first thing started when I took a job at a small town college as a PR and marketing dude, and one day I found a big envelope on my desk about a murder that had happened like 50 years earlier. That he said, and the note just said from the boss, "This occasionally gets asked about in the media. Make sure you understand it." And it was the whole murder file. So that started it, right?
Yeah.
That kind of almost small town gothic location plus these weird things that had happened. Boom, So Matty, I love that about what you're doing here as well. And now, how many books are we on now since that great first one?
So I have 4 books in the Ann Kinnear suspense novel series, the 5th coming later this year. And then I have 3 books in the Lizzy Ballard Thriller trilogy. And I also have a number of suspense shorts. So I think there are 6 Ann Kinnear suspense shorts available for people to purchase on the various retail platforms. And then one they can only get if they sign up for my email newsletter.
That means that I'm going to get that one, right? That's good.
Yes,
all right,
I
that's
hope
good,
so.
Because I'm signing up. All right. Okay. Let's get to the location aspect. Let's get to the sense of place and the making of the character. You told me it was the sense of that part of the title, but you had a sense too. And what I think is interesting that you as a writer and a creator of your own worlds, you're finding these backdrops, but you have a good sense of making those locations more than just a backdrop. But it's become, I think, and from what I know about your work, the location itself becomes a character. Is that a fair characterization of that?
Yeah, absolutely. And the sense of death is a good example because when I was picturing that scene in my mind with Anne going to the potentially haunted house, it was in San Francisco. And I was spending a lot of time in San Francisco at the time. My sister used to live in the area and I would visit her a lot. I became pretty familiar with San Francisco. But then as I started writing it, I'm in Chester County, as you mentioned, which is right outside Philadelphia. And the more that I wrote it, there were 2 reasons. There was the practical reason of it's going to be hard and expensive to do research into San Francisco. Enjoyable, but time consuming and expensive. Whereas here I have this great city, Philadelphia, right down the road from me. And so I relocated it from one of the beautiful Victorians in San Francisco to near Rittenhouse Square, which anyone who's knows Philadelphia will know, one of the beautiful old row houses near Rittenhouse Square. And once I did that, I can't imagine having tried to set that story in San Francisco because it's become, as you say, the Philadelphia area has become such a key character in 2 of my novels, the other key location being Mount Desert Island, Maine, as you mentioned.
Now, have you found that doing so in Philadelphia, of course, that's a major metro market, which is great. Have you found that setting your series there, has that helped you? Sorry to get into marketing, but come on, we have a lot of writers listening here. But has that helped you locally with bookstores and the like, or has it been kind of, or how do you feel about that? Has that helped you at all?
I think it has helped me. I wouldn't say it's a make or break kind of consideration, but it is definitely easier to approach a bookstore when you can say that, your book has a scene that takes place right down the street or,
right.
A scene that many of their customers are going to enjoy reading about, because I think people just like reading about fiction books that are set in areas that they know. It's been, I found, more of a selling point in Maine. So I've been able to get some traction in events on Mount Desert Island, which is where Bar Harbor and Acadia National Park are. My husband and I are long-term visitors to that area, and it has definitely proven a benefit. For example, cruise ships, in normal times come into Bar Harbor, and when people wander into town and they wander over to Sherman's bookstore, they're on the main street and are looking for a book. Oftentimes they're looking for something that's set locally, and so it's fun for Sherman's customers to find my books among the local interest offerings.
Right, exactly. You've got kind of a shelf waiting for you, is I think was my point. Also, too, I found some luck with libraries in particular. I definitely I'm in the system here in Kansas City, but in some neighboring areas. But I've also pulled in a couple of other libraries because the stories are set in those areas,
Yeah.
Okay, I'm not getting rich off libraries, but but still. It's a thing.
You never know. Every little bit
right?
helps.
It absolutely. It's funny. I was just I'd mentioned that the John Pilot mysteries are set half and half Nebraska and Key West And I was just in Key West, ventured out for the first time in ever because of, COVID finally went out. And I guess our window of opportunity was pretty good considering what's going on with Delta variant. But the point being, we were in Key West where I've set a lot of my stories. And I always bring a couple extra copies with me and leave it in the room I'm staying in and leave it, in the area. I've had no luck, though, in the Key West bookstore, to be honest with you, but they tell me they just get inundated with so many books that have Key West stuff. They try to stick to local people or top sellers, and I totally get that. But I do leave copies laying around.
I like that. I like that suggestion. I've done that if I've gone to like Airbnb or bed and breakfasts.
Right.
Oftentimes there's a copy of one of my books on the shelf when I leave that wasn't there when I arrived.
That's exactly what I did. We left. There was a power outage. We got up at 5 a.m. We were supposed to be at the airport by 5:45. Power outage and a whole thing, and we're running around trying to figure out what to do. And it's a big to do. And as we finally had an Uber, got there to get us to take us to the airport. I went, oh wait, I forgot. I've got to go put this book on the shelf. And I'm getting the stink eye from my wife, who's like, let's go. But I did it anyway. So
priorities are important.
Yeah, I mean, seriously, how often do I get there? So that's good. So have you done anything? Here's the question. Have you done any stories or any books in areas you've never been? As location.
I have not. If you were talking about like geographical areas, no. Certainly, I've set them like in police department,
Sure.
police stations and things like that I haven't necessarily been in. But no, in terms of the chunky, big geographical areas, it's all been places I know well. The Philadelphia area, Mount Desert Island, Maine, as I mentioned, and then Sedona, Arizona was the other place that my husband and I regularly vacation. And so there are some of those that I can look at as a native. Many of the Chester County readers will be able to recognize probably the restaurants that I enjoy in Chester County, even though maybe they aren't named, or the fact that I reference my alma mater, the University of Pennsylvania, and it's William Penn University in the Lizzy Ballard books, but it's a place I know and love. But I think that the difference, though, is that I am writing about the Philadelphia area from the point of view of a resident, and I'm writing about Maine and Arizona from the point of view of being a visitor. So I have never written a book where I'm portraying the protagonist as living in an area that I'm not familiar with, because I think it's quite different.
Yeah. Yeah, it is. I'm just curious about that because there's been a few things that I've done story-wise where I've just tried to figure it out in Google and all that stuff. But I know for a fact I've done better, obviously, the places where I've been because you can see it, taste it, smell it. You can listen to people. Key West, I mean, just the little details of chickens running by because it's a bird preserve. You can't mess with the chickens down there. You got to let them run free.
Cats.
Oh my gosh, the polydactyls in Hemingway's house, absolutely. Or there's a whole thing in my second book that takes place. There's a whole scene that's crucial to the book in President Truman's Southern White House down in Key West. And I would never have known had I not taken the tour of that place. So I totally with you on location and it's and that kind of thing. I think that's very important. That kind of reminds me, thinking about your dad. My grandpa in the 50s late 40s on until he passed away and around the turn of the century, wrote westerns and things. And he was born in Detroit, and he grew up in parts of Texas and Oklahoma, and lived in Oklahoma most of the rest of his life. And when he wasn't, in World War II and stuff. And I always ask him, though, this is a slightly different question, but I would say, you've never been a cowboy in your life. How do you even know? And he just told me, he says, I'm a meticulous researcher. And he was a historian by trade. I'm a meticulous researcher. So it can be done, obviously. But I don't know about you, but I just like the excuse of getting to go somewhere and look around.
Yeah, and even the local settings, as we were talking about the areas one knows as a resident versus as a visitor, I almost fell into a bad trap because in the Lizzy Ballard books, there's a scene where Lizzy and her father take the train along the main line, which is the string of towns that run along Route 30 that run west from Philadelphia. And the train runs along that area, and they take the train from near where they live at the time. They're living in Parksburg. I'm doing all these name checks for people from the area, and they go to 30th Street Station in Philadelphia. And so originally I had them leaving from Exton, which is like a pretty big hub, especially for commuters that commute from the burbs into Philadelphia. And then I thought, well, it's silly if they live in Parksburg, why would they go to, why would they go to Exton? There's a train station in Parksburg. So I basically just searched for Exton and replaced with Parksburg. And then fortunately, before the book went out, before it went to the editor, I was in the last stages of the work I was doing out. I thought, I've never been to the Parksburg train station. I should probably really go just to make sure that it's translatable. Thank God I did, because Exton is this kind of shiny, new, fancy commuter railway. And Parksburg is barely a train station. Like on one side, the only parking is like 6 spots in a dirt parking lot. And the building is closed. It used to have it still has a charming little brick station, but it used to be, functional, and now it's all boarded up. And I was like, oh my God, I would have been so much trouble if I hadn't made that trip. So sometimes it's great to do it in person. I have also had the case, though, where I had a character who was living in the Overbrook section of Philadelphia, and I just had to have like one sentence to describe what the back of her home. She lived in a row home, what the back of her home looked like. I was like, I could drive to Overbrook, which is going to take me like 45 minutes, an hour, look at the alley, and then drive home. Or I can go on Google Street View and save myself 2 hours. So it would have been fun to make that trip. But when you're weighing how you're spending your time, sometimes online is good.
Tell me about how you put a mystery together. I'd love to know, it might be helpful, actually, if you told us a little bit about each of your heroines and the types of books they are, and then maybe you could go from there into the types of mysteries that they both seem to fall into.
Sure. Well, I'm going to start with the Lizzy Ballard books, because the Lizzy Ballard books are a thriller. They're not really a mystery in the sense of trying to figure out who done it.
Yeah.
But Lizzy is a young woman, a 16, 17-year-old, and her backstory is that her the fertility clinic that her mother went to in order to get pregnant with Lizzy modified her treatment, and Lizzy was born with a special skill. All my books are about what happens when an extraordinary ability transforms an ordinary life. So Lizzy is born with an extraordinary ability, which would be a bit of a spoiler to share what it is. But it's a thriller in the sense that thrillers are always about, will the protagonist get away? Will they survive? Right. Will their friends survive? That kind of thing. The Ann Kinnear suspense novels, I originally billed as suspense novels because the first one is not a mystery at all. There's the murder in the house, the murder in the Rittenhouse Square row house that the reader sees, but that the protagonist, Ann Kinnear, is not aware of. And it's really 2 storylines. It's the killer trying to get away with the murder, and Anne, over time, becoming more and more enmeshed in this situation without realizing what's going on. So there's no whodunit. The reader knows whodunit, but it's the suspense of, will Anne survive this encounter that she's going to ultimately have with the killer? And then, interestingly, each of my subsequent books has become more and more mystery-like, so that my last book, A Furnace for Your Foe, is strict mystery. It's strict whodunit. And it's been something I probably would not have done if I had, back in 2011, fully thought through an entire full-time career as an author, but it is what it is. So, and the readers don't seem to mind that change over time. So the later ones have become more true mysteries. And I really think that the key for me to writing a mystery is understanding the crime first from the perpetrator's point of view before I ever try to think about the story from the protagonist's point of view. Because I've spoken to mystery writers who say, I want to have a scene where the protagonist is chasing the bad guy through an underground parking garage, and the bad guy is carrying a bomb. I don't know. And then they have to write the whole story, like trying to figure out how to make that happen. And that just seems like so much work to me. And I think that it's much easier for me to say, okay, well, let's say that this guy, the bad guy, has a bomb. He's in the parking garage because he's just about to place the bomb in the parking garage basement, and and think through all, and then say, okay, now I'm the protagonist. I'm outside looking in at the crime that's happening. So if I see someone running through the parking garage, Do I think it's a problem? Do I think it's somebody who's running away? Do I know it's the bad guy? And I know people do it both ways, but I cannot fathom how people can write novels from the protagonist's point of view and then work in the villain's point of view rather than the other way around.
That's a great point. I hadn't thought about it that way, but yeah, that's a lot of work. That's tough to do. Yeah, have you ever done one that's strictly first person? Have you just strictly just what they see, you see? You ever done that?
No, it's always been third person. And oftentimes, even in my third Ann Kinnear book, that's kind of the switchover, because you do see a murder right in the beginning. There's that murder, but then later on, it turns out that there was another murder that people weren't even aware of. But it's always, it's usually a combination of some scenes from the protagonist's point of view, and then some scenes from the bad guy's point of view when you know he's the bad guy, or scenes from the bad guy's point of view before you know he's the bad guy.
Before you know it. Yeah. So tell me, how is it going for you as an author? Is one series, I mean, you don't have to obviously get into minute detail, but is one series kind of doing better than the other, or about the same, or is it just, because I'm just curious, because you're doing two different genres here, and I'm just curious
Right.
Where's the market leaning these days as far as you're concerned?
Well, for me, my primary series is definitely the Ann Kinnear series. It was the first, so it's been out there the longest. The first book came out in 2013, and I continue to primarily promote the first book, The Sense of Death, in the hopes that it will lead people in through the rest of the series,
Yeah.
and to alert people when a new story is available. The Lizzy Ballard Thrillers, there are 3 of them. It's a trilogy. There's not going to be a book 4 unless I also plan a book 5 and 6, I think. And so that's a little bit, just on the back list, kind of chugging along,
Right.
not doing a ton of promotion in that, because if I can get people into the Ann Kinnear books, I mean, it's a financial consideration. There are 3 more after the first one that they can read now. There'll be 4 more after the first one by the end of the year. With the Lizzy books, once they've read the 3, they're done with Lizzy until I get back to her. So yeah, the Ann Kinnear is sort of my bread and butter series.
Yeah. Do you have any? You mentioned just I've got to make sure I'm going to have 4, 5, and 6. So I'm going to do. But I mean, do you have an end in sight for any of them, or do you want to just keep writing them forever?
Well, for the Lizzy Ballard books, if I got back to it, so as I said, Lizzy is 16, 17. Actually, she's a young child when the first book starts, but
Right.
by the time of about halfway through the book, she's a teenager. And she's 16 or 17 through the rest of it. I think that if I got back to it, it would be several years later. So now Lizzy's an adult.
Yeah.
And
That was my next question, by the way.
Yeah.
Is she going to age? So very
Yeah.
good.
Yeah, I think she would need to. Just because I wish I could think of a nicer way of saying this, but there are things you can have an adult protagonist go through that it's just uncomfortable to have a teenage protagonist go through. So there were certain lines I didn't want to cross with Lizzy as a teenager.
I totally get that.
That so it opens up some more opportunities for mayhem if she's an adult. And I kind of know what I would want to have happen, but it's still so general that I wouldn't want to try to sit down at a keyboard yet and try to capture any of that for Lizzy. With Ann, fortunately, I'm usually only 1 or 2 ideas ahead of time, which is good because I don't get distracted by them. But I do have a pretty good idea of what I want the next book after the one I'm working on now to be, and maybe the one after that. And ideas don't seem to be a problem to come up with. It's the execution of the idea that's the challenge.
I understand. My series, book 8's coming out in Halloween, and it's probably the last one. I think its sales have been okay, but it's really, for me, been more of a labor of love anyway on this series. And I think I just got to a point where I just thought, I want to do something else, but, and I've said this before, being a writer is like always having homework, and having this series is, for me, always like, I can just get done with one, and I literally have readers, which is a blessing, saying, when's the next one coming? I got one reader, she's got my phone number, she texts me, when's it coming? I'm like, wow, okay, but I'm also I just feel like I can kind of break these shackles and move on to something else, and I'm going to get out of the genre altogether. I'm looking at horror. I want to write some horror.
Interesting.
Yeah, I have no idea if it'll be any good, but I want to try.
Yeah.
But I understand, not that I had his talent, but I understand what Conan Doyle felt like when he was just sick to death of Sherlock Holmes.
Yeah.
Although we saw how that worked.
Yeah.
He came back. That's what a
They
buddy of
pulled
mine
him
said.
back in.
They pulled him back in. Yeah, but it's what a buddy of mine said. He says, "Oh yeah, you're done with John Pilot. Yeah, we'll see a new book in about 5 years." I'm like, "Well, I'm not promising anything, but that may be what it takes." So,
Or you could give them short stories.
well, you are so good. You were reading my mind. I was getting ready to say, you are writing a lot of shorts and you're doing a lot of that stuff. So I wanted to tell you this real quick, just for context. And listeners are like, yeah, he's going to bring up his own book again. This is important. Matty doesn't know, folks, so calm down. But so what I did in the middle of my series, I did a book called Pilot 7, and it's 7 short stories from the perspective of everybody but the lead character.
That's cool.
He's talked about, he's mentioned, it's part of, but what it does, it's world building. It's filling out the rest of the world a little bit with popular secondary characters.
That's
and that
cool.
book, it did better critically than almost anything I've ever done. And it sold all right too. So I loved writing that. I enjoyed that so much. So I wanted to ask you something. Do you find creating those shorts for your characters easier than writing the full book?
Well, they're faster.
In a practical way, they are, I guess,
Yeah, because they're like 4,000, 5,000 words as opposed to the novels, which are like 85, 90. They're you bring a slightly different perspective to them because, every word counts in 4,000 words, that you can be a little more loosey-goosey in 85 or 90,000 words. But I find that when I write a short story, it's usually because there's like a very specific, I'm trying to think of a word other than gimmick, and I'm not really. I'll think of the word eventually.
A MacGuffin?
But kind of. But like a good example is not last year, but the year before, my husband and I went on a cruise, and we went from Hawaii to Vancouver, and so there were like 5 days when we were at sea. And being a mystery and thriller writer, of course, I spent half the time researching how many people fall or jump overboard from a cruise ship in the middle of the ocean. So I got like sort of fascinated about writing a story about that. And so as I wrote it, there were some themes emerged, so that it wasn't just a kind of mechanical description of somebody falling off or jumping from a cruise ship. There were some sub themes about how people deal with tragedy and things like that. Whereas with my novels, it's more like I have the big idea and then I fill in the details, the tropes and the mechanisms in order to flesh that out. But I can definitely see, like I intentionally keep my short stories sort of separate from the novels. Like I hope nobody ever tries to say, oh, this one must have happened between this novel and this novel, because I reserve the right to take one of those stories someday, make it a novel, and just pretend like the short story never happened. So they're a little bit separate in that way.
Okay, that's fascinating to me because mine jump around with different. Like I went all the way back to one character, his origin, how he lost his eye in Vietnam. I went all the way back there, and then I have one that's all the way in the future where it's like the son of the character is apparently around and an adult and doing stuff. So I love your thought on that because. You know what? I think this is so great. This is one reason I love doing a show, and I know you do a show, and I want to talk about that in a minute, is because I get to speak with other authors, and it's so useful and helpful to me because what you just told me is something, you just gave me permission, by the way, to not kill off John Pilot, but I can just maybe do a few shorts here and there and get on with my other stuff and not feel chained to a novel. I so appreciate that insight. Thank you. My session is over now. I get, no, I'm just kidding. Let's talk about something else we have in common, can we, Matty? We're both, for one reason or another, went the indie route. I'd love to know your journey.
Well, when I finished up The Sense of Death in 2013, I knew a couple of traditionally published authors through writers groups and things like that. And I went to them and I said, I'm debating which route to take. What would you recommend? And at the time I said, they must help you a lot with marketing. Well, no, not really. You must make more money. No, not really. And in the however many years since then, I've sort of condensed my thought about indie versus traditional into the A, the B, and the 3 C's. So I'm going to try it out on you and see what you think.
All right.
So the A and the B are traditional publishing. So the A is access in the sense that although I think this is becoming less and less over time, the chances that my book is going to be in a Barnes and Noble, unless I really work on it, it's not going to happen. Not that it's not possible, especially I think with James Daunt being more allowing local bookstores to make more decisions about what they're stocking. I could go to a Barnes and Noble and I could pitch, I'm a local author, put me in the local author section and I might be successful, but it's effort that I don't feel like going to.
Right.
And then the B of traditional publishing is bragging rights.
Yes.
It's just the fact that if I tell someone that my books are published under the William Kingsfield imprint, I'm never going to get the oohs and ahs that I would get if I said it was one of the big five or the big four or the however many bigs we have now. So those are the things that traditional publishing could give you.
Right.
But then the 3 C's of indie publishing, I think, are first of all, creativity. And by that, I mean, you don't have to be creative on someone else's schedule.
Nice.
If I get stuck on a novel, I can switch to a nonfiction work, or I can work on my podcast, or I could push the launch date back a couple of months because I thought of a good short story I want to write. I'm controlling when I need to be creative.
Right.
Control, I think that's obvious. I'm never going to have a book cover that I hate. I'm never going to have an editor who's insisting that I do something that I don't want to do. And then I think the third one that has really become more apparent to me is care. And by care, I mean, no one is going to love your backlist like you do.
Yeah.
And as I said, I'm still primarily promoting my first Ann Kinnear book that's now, 8 years old?
Yeah.
And making good money from it. And that's something that I believe traditional publishers are going to start doing that more because I think they're going to see that indie authors are benefiting from that, but it's not kind of part of their DNA. And so the 3 C's were sort of the reason I went indie, and I'm glad I did.
Thanks for making that case. That's an excellent way to do that. I totally agree with you. I think I came kind of close to getting representation, and back in the day of 2008 when I started pushing my stuff out, and but I didn't for various reasons. And in a way, maybe I'm rationalizing, but I think I dodged kind of a bullet because I have a lot of friends who, of course, my grandpa told me all about the publishing world, and he would not understand where we are today. I mean, he passed away, and he would not get it. He would think, oh, this is vanity press stuff. And I'm like, no, this is not vanity press stuff.
Right.
We're not buying dozens or hundreds of copies that's going to sit in our garage. We actually have them online in stores and that kind of thing. But beyond that, I think the aspect of it, though, for me, too, just to echo what you're saying, Matty, is I love that it's on my schedule, although sometimes I could use a better deadline, not going to lie. But I mean, the schedule is my schedule, and it's like you said, it's my cover. If I like, it's up to me. I'm not going to have a crap cover, the other things. And I don't, I have a developmental editor, and I have a copy editor. Some people don't believe that looking at my first book, but I do. I just had to fix some things on that first book yet again. I don't even know. I think there's some kind of weird jinx with that first book, but I think that's just the first book curse. But anyway, the point being, I agree with you on that so much, and I think that the idea too is that like your back catalog is not dead. Because you're pushing it and you're using it, like I think you're doing the same thing I'm doing, maybe to a less or different degree, but I use my first book as kind of a lost leader to get people in the door. To start the read the series, and I've seen that the real blessing I've seen from that strategy for me has been that I can see the sale of that first book, and then within a month, if I start seeing the second, third, fourth, you know what I'm saying? I'm just starting to see the long tail starting to form. So anyway, I think that works so much. I wanted to ask you, and in the time we have left, but we have a lot of other writers listening. A lot of them are indies. But before I ask you this, I'll say the only thing that does not hurt, but I wish I could have is a little bit. The first thing you said is just there's still a lot of stigma and there's still a lot of cred that goes with getting picked by a publisher, But I don't know. From everything I've heard about all the other headaches with the marketing and with the getting paid and all the royalties and how it's not all so cracked up to be, it sounds like it's kind of almost a Pyrrhic victory to get traditionally published these days, unless you have a bestseller and otherwise. So I don't know. Do you feel pretty good about your decision? I think you do, but.
Yeah, I do. And I think that the stigma is becoming more and more concentrated among the traditionally published world. And I think that the key is that indie publishers can't have a different level of quality expectation as traditional publishers. And I totally agree. I have an editor, I have a professional book cover designer. I think those are the two things that every indie publisher or every indie author really needs to get, because that's why I call it indie publishing, not self-publishing, because you can't do it all yourself. You have to run it like an independent business.
Yeah.
And as long as a reader could go into a bookstore and hold up your book and hold up a book from a traditional publisher and they can't tell the difference, then readers are in general not going to open up, look at the copyright page and go, oh, I'm sorry, I've never heard of that publisher, I'm not going to buy it. It's not how people read. It's not how people find things. And so really the only reason that I would still, a tiny part of me would theoretically like to have the experience of traditional publisher, the experience of traditional publishing is that as someone who podcasts and writes and speaks on the writing craft and the publishing voyage, it would be super cool to have an inside first person experience of that.
Yeah.
But I think it would be a hard-won lesson for an experience I don't necessarily want to go through. And I'm happy to just read up on it and talk to other people who've experienced it and figure that I understand it sufficiently for my purposes.
It's that Pyrrhic victory. I mean, again, yeah,
Yes.
okay, great. Be careful what you wish for, though, right? Because, you know, then you're chained. I've had a friend he's had a couple of these small range, small to mid-sized publishers buy him up and then basically handcuff him for 2 years and then go out of business. And then he's just like, I've lost 2 years when I could have been pushing out my stuff that was selling before these people blessed me with this great honor, And I thought, oh, wow. I've learned a lot from that. Matty, tell us about your podcast. Where can we find it? What's it all about? What's it called? What do you do on the show?
It is called The Indy Author, and that's Indy with a Y, I-N-D-Y, The Indy Author. The podcast is the Indy Author Podcast. And it is all about the writing craft and the publishing voyage. I enjoy using nautical metaphors to talk about those topics, hence the craft and the voyage. And I interview experts in both those fields. And I've been super lucky. I just spoke with Ben Winters, who just came out with the Quiet Boy, who is the author of the Last Policeman series and Underground Airline, some of my favorite books. There's nothing better than having an excuse to talk with someone who's written some of your favorite books.
Oh, yeah.
Spoken with people like Joanna Penn and Orna Ross and Sasha Black and Mark Leslie Lefebvre, Michael Aran, who are all big names in the indie publishing world. And also some traditionally published authors about craft topics like Robert Dugoni, Stephen James, Hank Philippi Ryan. So really, if you're interested in any aspect of writing or publishing, we hit it at one time or the other.
It sounds great. And I this is how I feel about the whole world we're both swimming in, this ocean. I'll use the nautical. Whole ocean, this whole ecosystem, this whole oceanic ecosystem we're in, we both swim in. I like to lift up other authors, and obviously that's why I do this show. And I like to lift up other podcasts. And I'm not competitive with other podcasts. So Joe Rogan and I both agreed that he could have the millions of listeners. I was fine with that. But no, let me ask you, kind of as we start to wind down here, unfortunately, but I know you've got books to write and market, and that's a whole day's work right there. But is there anything you've really got your eye set on that you can tell us about? Is there any big picture thing that's looming for you that you want to try with your fiction, or is there just kind of no, I'm going to keep my head down and keep on keeping on with my series? What's next for you, I guess, is the big question.
Well, this is sort of a little thing. This isn't a big strategic thing, but I was listening to your audiobook of the podcasting option. How do you like that as a little...
Bless your heart. The podcast option available now on Audible and Amazon.com.
Well, it's the available and Audible part that I need to catch up on, because I've written 2 nonfiction books. One is Taking the Short Tack, Creating Income and Connecting with Readers. And then I have a book called The Indie Author's Guide to Podcasting for Authors. And it's available in print and in ebook. But despite, honestly, It feels like years of trying to get the audiobook done. I have audio for for my novels, but I hire a professional
Yeah.
performer to do those. But I do think that people enjoy hearing the author read nonfiction books.
Yeah.
And I have even gotten I have the room that's all outfitted for the recording and the
Nice.
baffling and the equipment. And for some reason, I'm just really struggling with getting the audio recorded for those books.
Huh.
And when you said, like on your podcast, you'd said something like, "Who would write a book about podcasting and not having an audiobook?" And I was like, "I know." But one of the reasons I'm waiting is because I did do a couple of hours of recording for the first book, and it was coming in at some ridiculous, like I was spending, I don't know, like 10 hours for 1 hour of finished
Yeah.
product. And I was just like, oh my God, this is going to take me hundreds of hours to record this book. But one thing I'm keeping an eye on is these text to speech,
Mm-hmm.
voice double kind of things. And I'm really hoping that soon, like within the next year, I'm going to be able to produce a version of the books in audio that will be machine read in my voice. And I'm interested in that. I would never do that for a fiction book, but when I'm listening to nonfiction, I really just want the material.
Mm-hmm.
Like I'm usually listening to it at like 1.7 speed. I'm not hanging on the performance of the person who's doing it, except insofar as maybe their audio is bad or something like that.
Yeah.
But I just want basically a way to consume the content while I'm walking my dog, is what it boils down to. And I'm hopeful that very soon those kinds of technologies will be good enough that I can offer a very inexpensive version. You know, I could record that, not record it. I could have it played out by the AI and then say, okay, if you're willing to listen to a machine read it, you can have the audiobook for $1.99, you know, and it lowers the barrier. And then as the technology gets better and better, put it out on a platform where I can just continue to regenerate and
Okay.
update that material so that it's always as good as it can possibly be. But that was just on my mind because I was just listening to that podcast and I was like, yes, yes, I have to do something about that.
I think. Well, you know, I looked into just seeing if ACX, which is the arm of Audible that lets you do these things, lets you record them, if they would allow that. And right now they don't allow, like, you know, the Stephen Hawking voice, you know, that obviously. But if you're intriguing me with, so you're saying AI that would be your voice, though, right?
Yes. So as an example, the software that I use for my podcast is called Descript.
Mm-hmm.
And it's a tool that enables me at a very simple level to feed an MP4, let's say, into it, and it automatically transcribes it fairly accurately. And then they have a function called overdub where, let's say that I accidentally said, I was introducing a guest and I said, you know, welcome to episode uh, 90 of the podcast. And then as I was editing, I realized it was actually episode 91. I could actually insert 91 in my voice, and you train it like you read The Wizard of Oz, believe it or not.
Right.
You read minute after minute after minute of The Wizard of Oz, and the voice is it's recognizably mine and it's fairly natural. And I've just got to believe it's going to become exponentially more and more natural sounding very quickly because of the way the technology is going here. I think Google is also, not surprisingly, working on a separate thing so that I could I could train the AI in my voice. I could feed the text into it. And then I think if you're really good, you can tweak it like to get the right intonation and things like that. But then you're not worried about like background noise or my personal nemesis, lip smacks, and all that stuff that is okay for a podcast, but it's not okay for an audiobook. And that's kind of where I'm
Man,
looking to try to plug that hole.
you've got my wheels turning on that. That is brilliant. I never thought of that. And you know, on my own, the podcast option, I kind of decided I'm going to record it as if it was an episode of my podcast. To be honest with you, I use the same software. Each chapter is just a different file, and I submitted them that way. And I just told myself I'm not going for the Olivier here. You know, I'm just gonna be me. You know, and sound like
Yeah.
I do in my show. And that's all I did. But yeah, if I were doing, and I've thought about this, and I've been asked to do this. I've got an audiobook of my first novel. A professional did it. Great guy. But it's not. It's just over the years not been where we'd hoped it would be. So thinking about, I've been asked, well, why don't? Because I used to be an actor and I'm fairly animated and I can do voices. People said, well, why don't you just do the whole series, all 8 books yourself? And I just thought, Geez, oh Pete, so that would take so long because it's a
Yeah.
performance. Your voice will get tired. I mean,
Yep.
these are 230 to 250 page books. I mean, it's a lot. So you've got my wheels turning with this AI stuff, though. I like that.
Yeah, it's fascinating to read about, and even if you just think I use Apple, so it's probably Siri that's reading to me, but I've gotten in the habit of whenever I'm about to like send out my email newsletter, I always have Siri read it to me because I always find some little weird thing that I miss if I'm just reading it through myself. I have
Right.
Siri read me my books out loud because I catch a lot of typos and
That's so
awkwardness that
smart.
way.
That is so
And
smart.
it's quite a pleasant listening experience, so the technology is just getting so good that I'm thinking I might do that trade-off in order to plug that audio hole in my offering.
Okay, I know I've kept you too long, but I got to ask you one last thing. So,
Yeah.
have you ever used like some of this technology to actually write? Like, for example, anyway, long story. I normally compose with the keyboard, I typing and all that, but I just thought I was having a couple of bad days when I didn't feel comfortable, like my back hurt. I didn't want to sit down, and I thought, well, I'll just use this dictation software, and I'll just do this, and I just talked at it, and I got through pages and pages of stuff just talking. And then, of course, though, it doubled my workload, though, because I had to go back and edit all this stuff because, the
Yeah.
dictation software doesn't fully understand what you're saying. And I found if I didn't edit it right away, I don't know what I was saying either. So I'm just
Yeah.
curious, have you dictated anything?
I've made just tiny experiments in it. Inexplicably, the dictation software that I was using thought I swore a lot more than I do. And I'd be listening back and it would actually transcribe it too. So I'd be reading the transcript and I was like, I did not drop the F-bomb, walking the dog. And so there was that hang up, but I have tried it. And when I do it, I just talk very, very slowly because I just
Yes.
don't think my mind works that way. And what I find is that I tend to compose in my head while I'm walking the dog or folding the laundry or doing whatever. And then I can go to the computer and I can, capture most of what I've been coming up with. And I kind of don't want to mess with that because it seems to be working for me. And I just
Yeah.
think the dictation thing doesn't feel comfortable to me, at least
Yeah.
not yet.
I think you know what, Maddie. Honestly, I think it just got me over the hump those couple of days, and that's all I wanted to. Because I didn't find myself doing it much after that.
Yeah.
But I probably laid down two whole chapters with it. But oh my gosh, I have talked your ear off, Maddie. This is what happens when we have great guests.
It's just so much fun. Thank you.
Oh, it's a hoot! It's a hoot. All right, now the final question: how do people find your books? How do they learn more about you? How do they get to the podcast? All this stuff, by the way, folks. She's going to tell you, but I'm also going to put it in the link to the show notes on mgopod.com or just look wherever you get the podcast. But go, Maddie. Where do we find you?
If people are interested in my fiction, they can go to mattydalrymple.com, and that's Matty with a Y, Matty. And if they'd like to find out about my nonfiction platform, they can go to the Indy Author, and that's Indy with a Y, theindyauthor.com. And there you'll be able to find links to all my social media platforms and my podcast.
You're into the Y's because you have Maddie with the Y, you have Dalrymple
Exactly.
with the Y, and then the Indy with the Y. There's three of them.
And Dalrymple with a Y, yeah.
Yeah. So there you have it. That's pretty good. I guess now we know why, and why not.
Why?
All right. Matty Dalrymple, it's been a delight speaking with you. Thanks for joining us here on Mysterious Goings On.
It was my pleasure. Thank you so much for the invitation.
Hey, I hope you enjoyed our interview with Matty Dalrymple. Don't forget that Matty has a brand new great book for authors interested in podcasting, The Indy Author's Guide to Podcasting for Authors, Creating Connections, Community, and Income. It is available now on Kindle and just about any place else that you can care to look to find the book. I like this immensely. I'll tell you what, here's my review real quick. If you're an author considering using podcasting as a means to promote your work or to network with other writers, don't do another thing until you read this book. As an author and longtime podcaster myself, I found Matty Dalrymple's book a vital resource. It's a detailed look at what works, what doesn't, how to get started, and how to keep your show fresh. It's written in a breezy conversational tone. It's chock full of Dalrymple's beloved nautical metaphors and references. Readers will learn ways to be a better host, producer, and guest, whether you're an experienced admiral or a brand new midshipman to the craft. This book should be on every podcaster and author's shelf. Chart your course and get this book. Again, Matty Dalrymple's new book on podcasting, The Indy Author's Guide to Podcasting for Authors, Creating Connections, Community, and Income. You can find it at the usual suspects, or you can just click the link in the show notes. And I tell you what, you won't regret it a bit if you're an author wishing to get into podcasting. Set sail. You know, I love podcasting. I have since 2006, back when you had to use like a Dixie cup with string to make the thing work. And that's why I'm so excited that we recently moved Mysterious Goings On to Anchor FM to record our podcast. I gotta tell you, I don't regret it a bit. If you haven't heard about Anchor, it's the easiest way to make a podcast. Let me explain. First of all, it's free. There's creation tools that allow you to record and edit your podcast right from your phone or computer. Anchor will distribute your podcast for you so it can be heard on Spotify, Apple Podcasts, and many more. And you can make money from your podcast with no minimum listenership. It's everything you need to make a podcast all in one place. I'm not going to lie to you, when I first heard about Anchor, I was a little dubious because I've been doing it the hard way for so long. But I got to tell you, it's very easy. Use a Stripe account. Get sponsors. You're not paying monthly hosting fees. The sound quality is great. The distribution is phenomenal. Friends, download the free Anchor app today if you want to start your own podcast, or go to anchor.fm to get started. Remember, you heard it here first on Mysterious Goings On. Thanks so much for listening to Mysterious Goings On. Don't forget, we have a complete archive of all of our interviews, monologues, updates, live readings, dead readings. All of that stuff is available at mgopod.com. And of course, don't forget to subscribe to us so you never miss an episode. We're on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, all the usual suspects. Please join us there. Again, don't forget, mgopod.com also has links where to find me on social media and how to get in touch in case you want to be a guest here on the show. Well, I think it's time that I move on for this week, but until next time, keep reading.